welcome to this panel discussion where we are talking about Muslim representation in video games. We're having this discussion as part of the release of Closed Hands from Passenger Games, which is a work of interactive fiction told from multiple perspectives about a terror attack in a fictional city in the UK. My name is Shaf Chowdhury, co-founder of the Riz Test, which is a project to measure the portrayal of Muslims in the arts, specifically film, TV, and video games. Dan Het from Passenger kindly invited me to moderate this discussion with some incredible panelists who are all creators, thought leaders, community organizers, and experts in this space. I'm going to let each of you introduce yourself. So I'm going to start with the order it appears on my screen. I'm going to hand it over to Umar first.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name's Umar. I am primarily a comic book writer, and this, in fact, while working on Closed Hand was my first sort of foray into narrative writing for video games. So it has been quite an experience and really interesting in the process and also the subject matter of Closed Hands. But yeah, I've been writing for about 5 years and hope to continue within video games. It's going to be interesting, what I'm saying from now on.
Thank you, Umar. Next up, we have Dr. Romano Ramzan.
Hello, I'm Romana. I am a games producer at No Code. So I'm based in Scotland, and prior to this, I've been in and out the industry, but I've been wearing an academic hat for quite a long time. So it's nice to kind of put that aside and get my hands all muddied again. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Romana. And finally, Anissa, over to you.
Hi, I'm Anissa Sanusi. I'm a UI UX designer at Roll7. We're a remote company based in London. I've been working in the UK games industry for the last 10 years, but prior to that, I'm actually from Malaysia, which is a Muslim majority country. And yeah, it's seeing Muslims in games is something that is close to my heart, and it means a lot more when it's done properly. So I think we're going to be going into that a bit more later on the talk, but I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you very much. I think what's really great is that each of you bring a really interesting perspective on in the same industry. We've got a really great cross section. So when we talk about Muslim representation in video games, it's not something that people think about really. But I know that each of you have spoken extensively about this in the past. Given that video game culture, broadly speaking, is culture, it's not a separate thing anymore. We live and breathe it. How important is in the video game art form is having good Muslim representation specifically? If I could start with Romana, because you spoke at what is the world's biggest and most influential conference, the GDC, the Games Developer Conference in San Francisco, about this topic. Why is this an interesting or an important topic?
So it's an incredibly interesting and important topic for the reasons that, we as Muslims form a quarter of the world's population. So, and we are consumers of games as well. So it's incredibly important to have not only our voices and views represented, but also have characters or, people that we can relate to as well. And oftentimes, when you see Muslim characters in games, I'm afraid it's almost always stereotyped. This concept of Islam and its place in the West, they're often at odds. And it's always projected as that, Islam doesn't have a place in the West. And when you see Muslim characters, it's always from a point or place of negativity, and the thing is that, as a global population, we as Muslims are so diverse as well, culturally across regions. So to say that all Muslims embody certain traits is doing a disservice to, a large subset of the world's population. So yeah, it's incredibly incredibly important to have that representation, and like Anissa said, to get that representation right, you know. And it's not an easy process either, because by having one Muslim character in a game, you know, it doesn't mean that that's your job done. You know, yep, I've represented all 1.6 million or 6 billion people, you know, and you will make mistakes, obviously, because like I said, there are cultural differences that do exist. But we need a starting point somewhere, you know, and it'll be so refreshing to see a character who's not stereotyped in how they appear, and in the roles that they play as well, which is often reduced to them being the other, you know.
That's really, really good point. In terms of some examples that people might be familiar with, can you give me some examples of where it hasn't been particularly good Muslim representation?
Take any of the military games. Where do I start? You know, most of the military games are, you know, everything is stereotyped, not just from the characters that you see, but the locations as well, you know. So it tends to focus on somewhere in the Middle East, and that somewhere in the Middle East tends to be, you know, it looks like a hellhole basically, and it's not an accurate reflection or depiction of any of those countries. And then, you know, the people there, they'll come across as your stereotypical crazy Muslim shouty people. You know, someone somewhere will say Allahu Akbar, and then that's it. You know, a bomb will be thrown or they'll get blown up, and you know, you as the protagonist will go and spray as many bullets as you can, and you're going to end up being, you know, the person that kind of saves the world from these barbaric people. So that, you know, so any of those, like, I don't know, I mean, I played Call of Duty a number of years ago, and that's basically what it was. But I think even games like, you know, Medal of Honor, Battlefield, that's typically what you see over and over again. So yeah.
Well, and I think the fact that Call of Duty is one of the biggest franchises out there is worrying. Extending that question a little bit for you, Anissa, you work in UX UI, which essentially is the kind of the bridge. You're like the bridge between the game and the player, right? And so when it comes to interacting with these virtual worlds in this kind of like third space, why do you think that that is an important consideration when you're designing a game?
Yeah, I guess from the lens of, say, representation and, you know, what that means, especially in a video game, because I think it's quite different from, say, films and TV, because with films and TV, it's quite passive, like you're kind of just watching it, right? But with video games, there's two ways about it. You're either creating the character yourself, so you are essentially trying to create yourself, and being in part of a culture, there's a lot of, I want to say, shorthands and things that would signify that you're part of that culture. So I would say the easiest thing that I tend to show is that if you go into character creation, could you put on a hijab for your character? That on a technical side, that is literally just another piece of clothing, another piece of thing that you can put on top of a ready-made character. So it shouldn't be too difficult to assume that, you know, you could create at least one or two styles that you can choose from out of, like, I don't know, 200 different hairstyles, right? But it doesn't stop there. Like, there's the other side of things where rather than making an avatar that is close to you, you are playing a character that's already written, that is supposed to have all of these signifiers, that they are from this certain culture or from this certain religion already there, and it's how much you can relate to them. So the same with how Romana said, like, the Muslim population is like 1.2 whatever billion, and even for me, like, because the reason I mentioned from Malaysia is because culturally, I think Malay Muslims, and I want to say any other Muslims from Britain who are from Pakistan or anywhere else, are so culturally different as well, even for us. But we do have common ground. So when I see, let's say, a Pakistani character on screen, I'm not from that culture, but I feel this certain solidarity because we're still fellow Muslims. And if they're depicted badly, I still feel badly for them as well, because it's a really broad, like, usually negative paintbrush to put on everybody. And the reason it's so important in video games because there's an element of control where you're playing the game, you're making decisions, you're taking actions in the game, either as the avatar or playing through a pre-written story that someone else has written, and it affects you a little bit more differently, you know, like rather than passively watching a movie. Like it's odd to be in a game where if the only Muslim person that you see is a shooting target, and that doesn't feel great, right? It upsets me that I think, sure, video games need bad guys, you know, and obviously there's historically we've used people from other cultures as bad guys as well, but I feel like if they're, I want to say, if they're like from a white background, they tend to be treated with more nuance as the villains, whereas you know, Muslims are relegated to stereotypes. And there's a difference between using tropes and stereotypes. Like there are tropes are fine in of itself because they're shorthands of communicating to the player like what kind of person this person is or what kind of culture they're from. But stereotypes is just lazy and it's terrible. And I think, especially because video games is something that skews to a younger audience, what we put out there to younger people, especially if they're also, you know, Muslim kids, it affects you emotionally. It affects you how you view yourself. I'm sure there's so many, there will be people who wish they weren't born Muslim for one reason or another, and I don't want to feed that into them. You know, I don't want people to feel bad for what they represent through the media that we portray them in.
No, that's really interesting. I think what's something that you said that's really really key, I think, is that video games are experiential, right? You're participating in it, and when we talk about film and TV, as you said, you're a consumer of the art. You're watching it, and you're just watching the film, 90 minutes done. Games, I mean, these aren't like 1 hour, you know, finite 1.5 hours, 90 minutes in and out. These are, you play for days and months. I think what kind of a question back at you is, you mentioned that these are a relatively easy thing to do, just to get that, you know, increasing the number of customizations when it comes to character, you know, your avatars and whatnot. When it comes to these big studios who have seemingly huge budgets, why do you think they get it wrong? Is it ignorance? Is it laziness? Is it purposeful? What's your opinion?
I would never assume that a studio is malicious in any way. You know, it's usually, I would say, like ignorance, in a sense that sometimes it just doesn't cross their mind. And in that case, I wouldn't be too hard on them. And for those who do try, they might not have the best resources at hand, right? So like, let's say, you know, they've given it to a task to somebody to do. That person might have just Googled things and took whatever is the top search, you know, results. And what, you know, the best case scenario is that they actually spend money on consultants, people from that culture, from this community, to actually, you know, just say like, yep, that's how we are and that's how we should be represented. But that's usually an extra step, and that's usually something that needs to be decided from up top. People who are doing the budgeting, people who are doing the scheduling, like these are effort. Like it takes time and it takes people, it takes money, and it needs to be regarded as important as the rest of the game for it to be able to be executed properly.
Can I just jump in there as well and just say that I completely agree, like it does take time and effort, but in taking that extra step and doing something like that, you know, like it shows you care, like you care about us and that we matter to you, and doing something so small, like, you know, I mean, I've done this in the past, like you get so excited, you share it with your friends, you're like, oh my God, see, you know, like, I mean, WhatsApp brought in like the female emoji with like the hijab, and I mean, in almost every single WhatsApp group that I was in, all my friends were like, did you see that, you know, this is now a thing? So something that might seem either like a little bit of effort, or it might seem like it's not a big deal, like for us, it's huge. It's absolutely incredibly colossal.
Yeah, and I think that point of it, you know, a little bit goes a long way sometimes with these things. I want to bring in Umar at this point. Same question to you in terms of why is it important? But I'm really keen to understand from your perspective. You're a storyteller. Not only you're a very talented, you're artist, but in terms of telling these stories and these narratives, how is it important for you to have that at mind when you're doing your work?
Yeah, it's well, when I'm constructing a story or putting the narrative together, alongside with representation, I think the most important thing, and Anissa talked about this earlier as well, is the research. And the research really needs to be worth its weight. And what I feel sometimes, be it in film, TV, comics, or even games, the research just seems to match what the really, they don't seem to have it matching what the story is. They just seem to have what it seems at time is, we need a placeholder villain here, and chances are we're going to make them Muslim. Okay, great. It happens that there are good or bad Muslims in the world. It's just how it is with everyone else in the world. But where they sort of differ from that path is when they are like, that's where it seems that the research stops. They just sort of, like, for example, when we're talking about Call of Duty, it all looks like a nondescript Middle Eastern or a country from that location. However, there are, like, I'm from Pakistan myself, and there are multiple nuanced differences between each of these countries. You can't call it Irakistan or something like that, because not only is it, let's be honest, offensive, it just shows that they didn't put that effort in initially to get that research done, to get that story told, and it just seemed that they had that person there, just, or that Muslim villain or any or sort of negative representation, just for the sake of it, which again just sort of deters people from playing that game and seeing yourself within there, because no one wants to see themselves as a bad guy, and no one wants to see themselves, at worst, a generic bad guy. If there was effort on there, then there'll be you'll understand what's going on. But it's that lack of effort, which I don't think, going back to what Romano and Anissa were saying, that I don't think it's malicious, and I don't think there's intent there, because I just think it's that lack of understanding or that ignorance that's there that they don't really choose to address, because it just seems easier just to get that game rolling, really. So my thing would be, along with the representation, to really, really do your due diligence on the research, really understand exactly what you're going back to the hijab sort of point of view. When you say, yes, having a hijab, that's a great initial first step. However, there are different varieties of the hijab, going from the niqab, the burqa, everything. There's like, which do you want? But sometimes when you repeat that information back to someone who's creating the game or going ahead there, their first reaction is normally, oh, there's different versions. It's a good dialogue to have, but you're like, yes, there are, and just further research. That's my only sort of like plea that I have with the people who want to include Muslim characters in their games.
Well, that's a good point. I think that, as Anissa said earlier, the Muslims aren't just one homogenous blob of people that you can categorize easily. There's not only these cultural differences, there's differences within populations as well. It's really nuanced. And I like what you're saying. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing what you're saying there, Umar. What you're saying is, we don't mind being the bad guys, but make us interesting bad guys, right? Make us interesting and nuanced and interesting, complex characters. This is a question for anyone, really. And I know that you're all being very polite and incredibly professional, but I'm trying to provoke you a little bit. Do you have any examples where you really saw a video game and thought, hang on, this is really bad? And Romano, we mentioned, we talked about Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, Black Ops and whatnot. Are there any other examples that we would think, actually, this is really bad? Or if you to kind of as a get out, have you got any examples of really good representation of Muslims?
Well, what I would say, firstly, correct me if I'm speaking out of term here, but the sort of telling argument here is that the examples of characters within games that are Muslims is few and far in between, because I have to really rack my brain to think of it. So that initially at the ground level is a sort of there's a sort of disconnect, there's a sort of issue there at the ground level where if I was to give you my favorite American hero, you know, GI, there's loads to choose from, Tom Clancy, this, and, you know, all these to play from. The sort of scope that you have as, you know, a Muslim character or a significant Muslim character within the game is kind of rare. But I can't remember her name, but I do like the Deus Ex series, and there's a pilot in there who was a really good representation, because not only was she a Muslim, but from what I recall, she's pretty awesome in, like, she was, again, competent in her job, really helped out the character when needed, all the positive things that you want to associate with this character. And that's where I think the sort of nuance comes in, because it's not until when you probably read the game Wikipedia or whatever, when you sort of read a bit further, oh yeah, she was a Muslim, and that wasn't forefront, and that wasn't used as a sort of stereotype or anything like that. So that's one character that I can think in the good way.
Yeah,
that was represented.
Farida Malik, right?
That's it. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. Romano, you've been terribly, terribly polite here. I want you to be controversial for me, please.
I mean, I think the pause at the start kind of said it all there. You know, when we're trying to rack our brains to games that have done it badly, again, you can categorize them into just one pulpit, you know, because they all have done them really badly. Because most of the times we are in that, you know, we are the villains. And if you look to the games that have done it well, so I did a quick Google search ahead of this chat that we were going to have, and it's interesting, like the field really hasn't advanced in the last few years, you know, like the one game that for me, and I've quoted it a few times before, but it's something that really resonated with me and it was powerful and it stayed with me long after I played it, was Bury Me My Love. So I don't know if you've played it or not, but it was developed by a smaller studio. The name at the moment escapes me. However, it was a very powerful game that showed you the very real situation of you know, refugees and migration and the effects of war. And so the game plays out, and I'm not going to spoil it for anyone because I would definitely encourage, if you haven't played it, to play it. But the game plays out as like a series of WhatsApp conversations between a husband and a wife, and the wife is trying to flee Syria and she's trying to make it, you know, to safer shores. And it's really raw because, you know, you have two different modes in which you can play the game. One is like real time, or you can speed it up just to kind of get through it. And I would encourage anyone to play it in that real time mode, because there's often like long spells where you don't, you know, you don't hear from her and you're wondering, like, has something happened, you know, has she succumbed to something really, really bad? And for me, that was like an incredibly powerful game, and I thought it was a game that was done really well. It showed you Muslims in a different sort of context to how you normally see them, but it also kind of showed you like this humane side of this big problem. And I think for a lot of people who are maybe not so aware or are constantly worried about, you know, immigrants and so on, like, I would encourage them to play it, because it might change how you perceive or think about people who are in that situation. So for me, that was a really powerful, you know, game. And I think in the past there have been, I think was it last year, like Animal Crossing and also Overwatch, they kind of there was like a nod to this, you know, the cultural aspects of our religion as well, like with Ramadan, you know, they tried to incorporate parts of that, which was nice to see and refreshing. But yeah, I mean, other than that, games that have done it really well, I struggle. I don't know if Anissa has any like thoughts on anything that comes to mind, but for me, it would definitely be Bury Me My Love. That's powerful.
Yeah, that's one of the games that I keep telling myself I should play it, but because I know somewhat the premise of it, I'm just like, oh, I don't want to be sad. I'm already sad. But I would say, like, I think in recent memory, there's talks about 6 days of Fallujah. Yeah, and I have industry friends who are Muslims who obviously have voiced concern about that video game, because that is essentially that is very much, you know, Muslims are bad guys kind of trope, and it feels very, those kind of games again, it tends to be military related games, because it's such a propaganda machine, I want to say. Again, feeding this back to younger people who play these games, and you're kind of like subconsciously training them to feel antagonistic against Muslims. So yeah, I would say that in recent memory, that is like one game that I would probably never touch with a 10-foot pole, just because it's from the optics of it all, it's pretty bad. So much, it's even worse when there's interviews with the creators where they would say stuff like, "This game is not political," and everyone just like, ugh. But if we're gonna celebrate games that does it well, I would say one of the games I recently played is actually Marvel's Avengers. So I know this crosses over the comic and movie area as well, because it's Marvel, right? But there's the character Kamala Khan, who is a teenager from of Pakistani descent in, I want to say, New York. Is that right? Yeah. And playing that video game, she's the main character in that game, I would say. And her character is so well written. I love her so much. She's cute. She's got spunk, and she is a stupid teenager, just like how most teenagers are. And the fact that she's Muslim is kind of like, it's represented not so much. I mean, it is her, but it's like not on the nose. It's not like, she doesn't wear a hijab, actually, but her superhero suit is actually quite modest and quite, befitting of a young Muslim girl, I would say. And the side characters, like her parental figures, oh, I love them so much. And the way that she has family banter with them as well. That kind of things, which I think I resonated with quite a bit, even though I'm not specifically from that culture. But there's a few things that, I stand in solidarity with. So I think that's really nice. I think they definitely did a lot of really good research. And from what I read on the internet, she's the character is having her own Marvel series coming out at some point, I think. And as far as I know, the community is loving it. Everybody loves Kamala. Like, I have not heard anybody complain about her. So that, I think, is a really good example of good representation.
Yeah. Kamala Khan is, as you said, universally loved. Everyone, who's read the graphic novel or played the game absolutely loves it. So I'm seeing themes across each of you. It's not just seeing yourself within the game for Muslims, but it's also building empathy for people who aren't Muslim, and understanding that, and to kind of break down this theme of otherization, that they are the enemy, that they are the other. And Lisa, you've really brought it. It's a perfect segue. Actually, there's a question that's come in from Sadia, and this is for everyone really. But this is kind of alluding to the some of the dress that Kamala wears. And the question is, why is it so hard for games to have one single female character who is covered enough, not of the sexy character and not the childlike one? As an avid cosplayer, I always struggle to find any female characters that fit well. She goes on to talk about how armor isn't covered in a real fight. That armor would cover nothing. So, what do you what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, you know what? I felt that because when I was younger, when I was in my teenage years, I really wanted to get into cosplaying, but I could not, for the life of me, find any character that was modest enough where, if I get changed in the house, my mom's not going to be like, "What are you wearing?" And I'm like, ah. And you know what? Props to a lot of like hijabi cosplayers out there who have managed to like make those characters modest. And I think that's great. But that's also an extra step. I just, we kind of wish that was characters out of the box that is completely like, yep, I can do that. It's easy. And I think that's I would say that's a cultural thing that we need to push past, where that in anything that you make is that sex sells, right? So that's the only reason why skimpy clothing or sexy things, like, like I also consume all of those things. Like, I love me a really good K-pop group that looks sexy, it's great, but also I think that should be a balance where you could also consume things that are people who are modestly dressed, and younger girls could cosplay and not feel too exposed. I don't even think this is like a religion issue. Like modesty, any culture, like any girl out there would love to have options. That's the thing. We want options.
That's a really good point. I've got another question which I'm going to, which is for everyone. But I'm going to ask Umar first, if that's okay. One question from Ahmed, and he's coming with: do you face any difficulties from what's expected of you as a professional in the industry and your personal beliefs? Is there a friction?
Well, yeah, it can be, because when I'm writing my stories, in video games or in comics, I try to focus towards like the story themselves, and like because there's like some crime stories or some story, like Untethered is a comic that I wrote, which had sort of Islamic influences in there, because it's about someone drinks the contents of a genie's bottle, and the story spins off from there. And when I sort of read it myself, and I read it there, and I've had people coming back to me and going, "Why aren't you including more stuff towards your religion, something like, just because you should write what you know exactly." But this is where it's kind of weird, in that, yes, I'm a Muslim man of Pakistani descent living in England, but it's that sort of where you have 2 feet in both worlds, and you do kind of feel that pressure where you're trying to tell the story that you want to tell, and tell it fairly, but then you feel like people come to you and saying, well, why don't you do it this way, because this is where where I see you coming from, this is where I think you should tell the story. And it just kind of feels kind of hard to take that on board, because it's like you wouldn't say this to another person who's creating something. Like, for example, if you want to tell people who are making the Game of Thrones story and saying, why are you doing about dragons, there's no dragons in your life. Well, it doesn't work like that. Like, let me tell my story, let me put my input into it, and hopefully if you like it and people like it, I can carry on. But it's that sort of, I'll be honest, used to sort of play on my mind a bit earlier on, when I was like, well, I have to, tell these stories within this constrained box that people have got set for me. But then I'm like, no, because that's part of the, why representation matters. As a Muslim writer, that I should be able to tell the story that I can, but tell it fairly, doing the research, doing the due diligence, and finding the story that I want to tell, but without it being constricted to what you quote unquote want me to write for you. So there is that friction, but it's working past it, and also picking on what some people would deem as some people would say as a negative, that you're constricted to what you can write. But since I have feet in both worlds, because Muslim man, but also living in England, it gives me more freedom to sort of, I can sort of take from both worlds, and that's the sort of positives that come from it. And if I'm being honest, it's been really helping with the story. So I've managed to turn that sort of friction, that sort of pushback, into a positive, really.
So I think your perspective is quite unique, I think, especially given that you are one of the writers on Closed Hands.
Mm-hmm.
How have you used that to your advantage in this project?
Yes, because the character that I wrote was Hazik, who is, just a brief sort of recap on Closed Hands. It's 5 characters, a narrative story told from their sort of point of view, and like Anissa and Romano were talking about before, getting into the nuance and sort of, what's it called, the sort of emotive feelings, rather fully fleshed out characters. And one of the characters is a Muslim man who is the father of the guy who did the attack. And what I sort of took on there, because he is very similar to like a lot of people that I know in my sort of day-to-day life. By that I mean an older, I think of Pakistani descent man who was just sort of able to understand how they would react if this was to go ahead. Because I'll be honest, something like this, because it hasn't happened to me, thankfully, it hasn't. None of this is a really harrowing and really big event that can happen in anyone's life. However, there are parallels to when some sort of big issue happens within a family, and I'm seeing it firsthand in other families of how people react, and how surprisingly if you're a Muslim or if you're not a Muslim, you will react the same way if there has been a tragedy in your life. But there are little nuances that I'm able to implement from my life in this is how I believe Hazik would react in this situation, as I'm able to go back on my personal experience, go back on my personal, just living within my community and apply that within the story. So yeah, that's what I've been able to put into Close Hand, I believe.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much, Umar. I want to turn to Romano for a second, because you're not only are you from do you work in the industry, but you're also an educator, and that's what you spent a significant period of your life doing. How do you equip the game developers, the interaction designers, the storytellers, the UX UI, the professionals of the future? How do you educate them in being sensitive to these things, or can you?
We often, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult topic to approach, to begin with, because again, one of the problems or things that tends to crop up is that, if being Muslim, you almost feel like you're an ambassador for the religion as well, and that's got certain preconceived kind of conceptions and notions, and people kind of think, are you fueling your own agenda? And it's nothing to do with that. And when you're talking about like representation, it's not necessarily a case of that I want to see more games to do with religion or Islam in there. It's more to do with just showing like the world as it actually is. So when it comes to students and so on, often what I say to them is just ask yourself a very simple question, like what would this character look like if you changed one single thing? And from there, keep iterating upon it to see where does your character land, and does that give you something that's far more interesting than your stereotypical hero that always tends to crop up in every game. Because often you find that it's not like what Anissa said before, it's not something to do with deliberately being malicious or coming from a bad place, but it's often just people don't ask themselves that question, like what if my main character in this game was to be a female, like what would that look like, what would the experience be? And then if that female happened to be a person of color, again, how does that change the experience? So it's just kind of getting them to kind of broaden their horizons by just challenging them with questions, and it's questions to get them thinking.
That's a fair point. I think oftentimes when you are Muslim within an industry, whether it's film, the arts, video games, whatever, there's often a burden of responsibility that you have to represent 1.x billion people, which just isn't possible. I can barely represent myself. I think we had one last question that's coming from Sarah, which has kind of been already answered by Anissa, but interested in people's views on Kamala Khan, character from Marvel, her being debuted in a game and getting a TV show. What are everyone's thoughts on the character and having Muslim representation in such a big franchise? So we kind of covered that a little bit with Anissa. And what I wanted to do is extend that question a little bit and talk a little bit about NPCs, non-playing characters, for a moment. Anissa, from your perspective, how important are NPCs? I mean, first of all, what are NPCs? And second of all, for the audience to educate them. And second of all, how does that have an effect upon you when you're in that space?
So NPC stands for non-playable characters. So they are basically all of the other characters that your character might encounter in a video game. So it could be a shopkeeper, could be just somebody on the street, could be like just background, and I would say it's really important because I was just thinking about this. People who are not necessarily represented much, they have like this really weird eagle eye where like the moment they find somebody who looks exactly like them or has some kind of indicator that, they're like oh, look at that. Oh, that person has a hijab. Oh my gosh, and that person's like this small on the screen and in the background's over there, and we all freak out. And I remember this happened with Spider-Man, one of the Spider-Man movies. One of the students had a hijab on, and it was just like a freeze frame of like a blurry girl like ducking for her life, and it's like, oh, she's Muslim. And it's that kind of stuff, And I remember even just playing some JRPGs, and one of the games I was playing called Bravely Default. So it's on the 3DS. I'm not sure if many people played it, but like one of the towns is set in a desert like town, and some of the shopkeepers had like a niqab on. I don't think they're particularly Muslim, but it was someone of that region, and I was like, oh, that's so cute, because it was in the little like anime style and the thing on, and they contributed nothing to like the main story. They were again just NPCs, but I was excited. I'm pretty sure I took screenshots and shared it on my Twitter. So that's how like representation, how like the crumbs, the tiny bits that we get, we still celebrate it just because of the sheer amount of nothingness of most of the time. So the fact that Kamala Khan is such a big thing, right? Because she's like a main character. She's having her own series. Like she's named. She has a whole backstory and everything, and that's great. But at the same time, the moment that this kind of character is sprinkled around like normal, that I think that's a nice place to be, because we are normal people. Why must the spotlight be on us when we're going through like great difficulty or some kind of crisis? Like we are not just our traumas. We are more than that. We have our regular days. We have our happy moments. So as much as I do love the games that concerns them with more of the tragedy or like the struggles, and you want to empathize for the characters and you feel for them, those like oof, straight to the heart stuff, like Closed Hands and Bury Me My Love. Great games, but at the same time, I don't want to play sad games. I would love to see someone like me thrive, doing great things. There's a reason why Wonder Woman was so popular, because suddenly it's like the strong woman doing everything, and you coming out that movie feeling like, oh my gosh, is this what men feel like every time they see a superhero movie? That kind of thing. And it would be great to have that with just the general community and the Muslim community as well. Again, it's not so much shoving Islam in everything you do, just like, do they have to be the default white person? They could literally be anyone from anywhere, and we exist. 1 point something billion of us, we exist, we're there. It'd be great to see that reflected in the media.
That's a really, really important point. Yeah, especially about just seeing people like you thrive in the arts that we engage with. And we're coming to the end of the session. If I could go through each of you, if you could give one piece of advice for someone watching this as to how they might engage with this art form more critically, arbitrarily going to say, if you had to kind of compose a tweet, what would it be? What takeaway would you give them? Umar, I'm gonna pick on you first.
Okay, I'll try to keep this within 280 characters, I guess. So I would just loop back to what we were saying at the beginning. Representation is important and it does matter. But if you are going to represent Muslims within your game, please do the research, and please do beyond the arbitrary sort of Google search that you might do. Like get someone on board, like similar to what Dan Het did in Passenger Games with me. He invited me to work on the game as I was able to give a voice to this character who was a Muslim man, and I really hope, well, from what I'm getting the feedback, that it helped out in that game. But yeah, going back to it, sorry, the small bit when you're doing representation, do the research.
Brilliant, thank you. Romana, how about yourself?
I would say that diversity is not a box ticking exercise, and ask yourself, what is authentic representation?
Great stuff. Just about a tweet there. And finally, Anissa.
Oh God, I probably should have thought about this before you came to me. I mean, hire people. I don't know.
Sorry, I did put the three on the spot there.
No, like hire people, pay people the money to consult. Like, it's fine, it's great. We're here, we're happy to contribute. Like, diversity is an issue in the games industry itself. Like, we are trying really hard to get more diverse candidates to be the person making the video games. Yeah, hire diverse candidates, one. And number two, if your workforce isn't diverse enough for the piece of media that we're doing, hire somebody and do the research. It's that easy.
Brilliant. Thank you all of you. I've had a really great discussion. I thank you all for joining this panel. If we wanted to learn more about the work that you do and how we can find out more about that, how do we do that, Anissa?
You can find me on Twitter at Studio Anissa. I'm also on Instagram and TikTok. And I also run a mentorship program called Limit Break Mentorship on the side. I'm all over the internet talking about stuff that I care about.
Probably one of the funniest Twitter accounts, I've got to say.
You.
Umar, how can people hear more about you and your work?
Myself, I'm on Twitter, Moderator, all one word. I tweet mostly about my work and just random what I call shower thoughts, because Twitter is, let's be honest, sometimes a downer itself. So I just go on there just to promote my stuff and anything that I might find funny. But yeah, you can reach me out on there. I think on Big Cartel and what's the other one? Gumroad. That's it. My comics work on there, and obviously Close Hand. You can find it on Close Hand on, I think it's closehand.io or something like that. But obviously you can find it online.
Great stuff. Yeah, I've seen some of the graphic, the artwork that you do as well. Really great. And finally, Romano, how can we follow some of your research?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter and my handle is Manak, M-A-N-A-K.
Brilliant. And you end up underselling yourself. I've read a few things that you've written as well, all really, really insightful, so especially around this space. Romano, Anissa, and Umar, thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate your time.